The Milwaukee County Courthouse stood like a stone guardian in the morning light, its weathered granite facade a testament to decades of justice, and sometimes injustice, served within its walls. Through the imposing brass doors, past security checkpoints where regulars exchanged knowing looks, Courtroom 4B buzzed with the nervous energy of defendants awaiting their fate. Judge William Barrett's reputation hung heavier in the air than the musty scent of old wood and anxiety. At precisely 9:00 a.m., he swept into the courtroom, his black robe billowing slightly with each measured step. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise," though several veterans of the judicial system were already standing, having learned through experience that Barrett noticed everything. The iron gavel, a nickname whispered in courthouse corridors, settled into his high-backed chair, steel-gray eyes scanning the assembly from beneath thick brows. At 62, Barrett wore his age like armor, each line on his face seemingly earned through years of passing judgment. His fingers, adorned only with a heavy college ring and a plain gold wedding band, shuffled through the morning's docket with practiced efficiency. "First case," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of 28 years on the bench. The morning proceeded like a well-orchestrated ballet of misdemeanors and minor infractions. Barrett's methodology was consistent: minimal patience, maximum adherence to the letter of the law. A young man with a broken taillight received no leniency despite his minimum wage job. An elderly woman's expired parking meter resulted in the full fine, her arthritis-related explanation dismissed with a curt wave. Assistant District Attorney James Chen shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the next case was called. He'd watched Barrett's proceedings for 3 years now, noting the subtle but undeniable pattern in the judge's sentencing. The statistics spoke volumes. Minorities consistently received harsher penalties in Courtroom 4B. "Sarah Thompson," the bailiff called out, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. The click of heels against marble drew every eye in the courtroom. Sarah Thompson walked toward the podium with a kind of confidence that turned heads, not from ostentation, but from an innate sense of self-worth that radiated from her very being. Her charcoal Burberry suit spoke of success, but it was her bearing that commanded attention. At 43, she carried herself with the poise of someone who had navigated countless boardrooms and broken numerous barriers. Barrett barely glanced up from his papers, his pen tapping an impatient rhythm against his desk. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows cast shadows across his face, deepening the frown lines that had become nearly permanent fixtures. "Another parking violation," he muttered, more to himself than the court. "Tell me, Miss Thompson, do you make a habit of disregarding city ordinances?" The corner of Sarah's mouth twitched almost imperceptibly. Her dark eyes, keen and observant, took in every detail of the man who sat in judgment. The slightly fraying edge of his robe, the worn spot on his chair's armrest, where his right hand habitually rested, the subtle tang of expensive cologne that suggested a man conscious of his status. In the gallery, a young law clerk leaned forward, pen poised over her notepad. She'd heard rumors about Judge Barrett's particular brand of justice, but something about this moment felt different. The air seemed charged with an invisible current, as if the universe itself was setting the stage for something extraordinary. Little did Judge Barrett know, as he peered down at Sarah Thompson with his characteristic blend of dismissiveness and disdain, that this unremarkable Tuesday morning would become a turning point in his career and his life. The scales of justice were about to be balanced in a way he never could have anticipated. Sarah Thompson stood at the podium, her hands resting lightly on its polished surface. The morning light filtering through the courthouse windows caught the diamond on her right hand. Not a wedding ring, but a reminder of her first successful real estate deal. Her posture remained impeccable, a habit ingrained from years of proving herself in rooms where she was often the only black woman present. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had learned to navigate prejudice with grace, "I understand the importance of civic responsibility. However, the circumstances that led to this violation were extraordinary." Judge Barrett's pen stopped its tapping. He looked up, more from surprise at her articulate opening than actual interest. The slight arch of his eyebrow betrayed his unconscious bias. He hadn't expected such professional poise. "Mrs. Thompson," he started. "Ms." She corrected him smoothly. "And if you'll allow me to explain." The gallery watched the exchange with growing interest. Even the court reporter's fingers hesitated over her stenotype machine, sensing the subtle tension building in the air. Sarah continued, "I received an emergency call from one of my properties on Highland Avenue. Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, an 83-year-old tenant, had fallen in her bathroom. As a former emergency room nurse, I couldn't ignore her call for help." She paused, letting the human element of her story settle. "I parked at the nearest meter, helped Mrs. Jenkins up, waited for her daughter to arrive, and ensured she received proper medical attention. When I returned to my car, I was 7 minutes over the limit." Judge Barrett's face remained impassive, but his fingers drummed a new rhythm on his desk. The mention of Highland Avenue, one of Milwaukee's more affluent areas, had caught his attention. Property owner. His eyes flicked to her suit again, reassessing. "Miss Thompson," he said, emphasizing her correct title with a hint of condescension, "while your humanitarian instincts are admirable, the law doesn't make exceptions for good intentions. The sign clearly states 2-hour parking." Sarah's spine straightened imperceptibly. In her mind, she calculated the mortgage payment on Barrett's luxury apartment, the one he didn't know she owned. "Your Honor, my record is spotless. In 20 years of driving in Milwaukee, this is my first violation of any kind." A young public defender in the gallery whispered to his colleague, "First time I've seen someone stand their ground with the iron gavel." His companion nodded, fascinated by the quiet dignity radiating from the defendant. Barrett leaned forward, his chair creaking slightly. "Perhaps that spotless record has led to a certain complacency regarding our city's regulations." His tone carried the weight of countless similar lectures, all delivered with the same patronizing authority. "The law, Ms. Thompson, applies equally to everyone, regardless of their circumstances." The pause before circumstances hung in the air like static before a storm. Sarah's fingers tightened slightly on the podium, the only visible sign that the judge's tone had affected her. She thought of her father, who had taught her to navigate these moments with strategic patience. "Your day will come," he used to say, "and when it does, make it count." In the back of the courtroom, Ada Chen watched with growing discomfort. He'd seen this before. Barrett's particular brand of equal justice that somehow always seemed harsher when the defendant looked like Miss Thompson. "Your Honor," Sarah said, reaching into her briefcase, "I have documentation of the incident, including Mrs. Jenkins' medical report and a time-stamped call log." "That won't be necessary," Barrett interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "The fact remains, your meter expired. The law isn't concerned with what happened before or after those 7 minutes. Now, shall we proceed with your sentencing, or would you like to further justify your disregard for city ordinances?" Sarah's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in her eyes. A look that, had Judge Barrett been more observant, might have warned him about the storm gathering on his horizon. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Judge Barrett straightened in his chair, preparing to deliver his verdict with the same self-assured authority he'd wielded for nearly 3 decades. The morning sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor, much like the shadow of doubt that had begun to creep into the minds of the spectators regarding the justice about to be served. "Miss Thompson," Barrett began, drawing out each syllable as if speaking to a child, "your attempt to justify this violation with an emotional appeal about an elderly tenant is, quite frankly, irrelevant to these proceedings." He paused, savoring his moment of complete control. "In my courtroom, we deal with facts, not excuses." Sarah's French manicured nails pressed slightly into her leather portfolio, the same brand she'd noticed Barrett's wife, Margaret, admiring at the Nordstrom anniversary sale last week. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been signing the papers to acquire Barrett Gardens, while Margaret had been lamenting the price tag. "Your Honor," Sarah interjected one final time, her voice carrying the weight of dignity that money couldn't buy. "I understand the letter of the law, but surely its spirit." "The spirit of the law, Miss Thompson," Barrett cut her off, his voice sharp enough to make his clerk flinch, "is to maintain order, something that people in your position should appreciate more than most." The pause before position lingered just long enough to carry its intended weight, causing several attorneys in the gallery to exchange knowing glances. Sarah's expression remained perfectly composed, though something dangerous flickered in her eyes. She'd seen that same look in countless board meetings, the assumption that she was somehow less deserving of her success, that her achievements needed more scrutiny than others. "Therefore," Barrett continued, shuffling papers with theatrical importance, "I'm imposing the maximum fine of $250. He looked up, his pale eyes meeting Sarah's dark ones with challenge. "Additionally, I believe some community service hours might help reinforce the importance of civic responsibility." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Maximum fine and community service for a 7-minute parking violation. Even the bailiff, who'd seen Barrett's harsh sentences before, raised an eyebrow. 20 hours of community service, Barrett declared, to be completed within 30 days. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "Perhaps spending some time cleaning our city streets will help you appreciate the importance of parking regulations." Sarah slowly opened her designer handbag, purchased from the same boutique where Barrett's wife had been declined for a credit card last month. She withdrew her platinum card, its surface catching the light. "I'll pay the fine now, Your Honor." Her voice carried a note of something Barrett couldn't quite identify. Was it amusement? "See the clerk on your way out." Barrett dismissed her with a wave, already reaching for the next case file. "And Miss Thompson, let's not make this a habit." As Sarah turned to leave, her Louboutin heels clicking against the marble floor, she paused. "Don't worry, Your Honor. I can assure you this will be a one-time occurrence." Something in her tone made Barrett look up, but she was already walking away, her straight spine and measured steps radiating a confidence that seemed almost inappropriate for someone who'd just been fined. In the gallery, the young law clerk who'd been taking notes whispered to her colleague, "Is it just me, or did it feel like she was the one in charge just now?" "All rise," the bailiff called as Barrett prepared to move to the next case. As the courtroom shuffled to their feet, Sarah Thompson was already stepping into the hallway, her phone in hand. "Janet," she spoke quietly to her assistant, "pull the Barrett Gardens file. And call my attorney. We need to review the renovation clause in the lease agreements." She paused, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "It's time for some civic improvements." Judge Barrett, settling into his next case, had no idea that his words about responsibility were about to echo back to him in ways he couldn't imagine. Pride, after all, comes before the fall. And his was going to be spectacular. The 43rd floor of the glass tower offered a panoramic view of Milwaukee's skyline, but Sarah Thompson's attention was fixed on the 6 monitors before her, each displaying different aspects of her real estate empire. The afternoon sun glinted off Lake Michigan, casting a golden glow across her corner office, a space larger than Judge Barrett's entire courtroom. Ms. Thompson, her assistant, Janet Chen, entered with practiced efficiency, carrying a stack of lease renewals. "I've highlighted the priority documents for your review." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "including the one you specifically asked about." Sarah swiveled in her ergonomic chair, her courthouse attire now replaced with a casual yet elegant street John knit suit. "Thank you, Janet. And the background check I requested." Janet placed a separate folder on the glass desk. Judge William Barrett's complete financial history, property records, and personal information. Very interesting reading, especially the rejection letter from Lakeside Estates last year. She hesitated. He tried to get in there before settling for Barrett Gardens. Barrett Gardens, Sarah mused, allowing herself a small chuckle. He probably assumes some old man named Barrett owns it. She opened the lease renewal, her eyes scanning the details she already knew by heart. Unit 1701. The premium corner apartment with the wraparound balcony. The same unit Barrett had insisted on, throwing his judicial weight around during the application process. The computer screens surrounding her displayed various properties: luxury condominiums, commercial spaces, affordable housing developments. Each represented a careful step in her 20-year journey from emergency room nurse to real estate mogul. A journey punctuated by moments exactly like this morning's courtroom scene. "Pull up the Barrett Gardens financials," Sarah instructed, her fingers dancing across her keyboard, the center screen filled with spreadsheets and projections. "What's the occupancy rate?" 98%, Janet replied promptly. "With a waiting list for the premium units. We've had 3 inquiries about Judge Barrett's floor this week alone." Sarah nodded, her mind already calculating possibilities. She pulled up another document, the master lease agreement she'd crafted when acquiring the building. Her legal team had called it airtight, with clauses that gave management considerable latitude for property improvements and necessary adjustments. "Janet, call Fisher Construction. Remember that renovation proposal they pitched last month?" Sarah's voice carried the calm authority of someone used to moving millions with a single decision. "Tell them I'm ready to discuss Phase 1. As Janet made notes, Sarah's eyes drifted to a framed photo on her desk. Her father standing in front of his small mechanic's shop, his hands greasy, but his smile proud. He taught her that success was the best revenge. But sometimes, success meant having the power to teach necessary lessons. "Also," Sarah continued, "schedule a building inspection for next week. Full assessment, electrical, plumbing, structural, everything." She pulled up Barrett's rental application, noting his meticulous emphasis on his position as a judge. "Focus on the 17th floor." The late afternoon light caught the edge of her Woman Entrepreneur of the Year award, one of many accolades lining her office walls. Each represented a barrier broken, a stereotype shattered. And now, ironically, they would serve as silent witnesses to her most satisfying victory yet. "One more thing," Sarah added as Janet turned to leave. "Send me the surveillance footage from the lobby last month, the day Judge Barrett's wife was denied the store credit card. I want to review something." Left alone, Sarah stood and walked to the window. Looking out over the city, she conquered one building at a time. 7 minutes had cost her $250 and a lesson in civic responsibility. She smiled, wondering how Judge Barrett would feel about his own lesson in responsibility, one that would cost considerably more. Her phone buzzed. A text from her property manager at Barrett Gardens. Judge Barrett's water pressure complaints came in again. Maintenance schedule. Sarah typed back a single word: wait. Sometimes justice needed more than 7 minutes to be served properly, and Sarah Thompson had all the time in the world. Late evening painted Milwaukee's skyline in shades of amber and purple as Sarah sat in her office, carefully crafting what would become her masterpiece of measured revenge. The desk lamp cast a warm glow over the documents spread before her: lease agreements, building codes, and renovation proposals, all perfectly legal, all devastatingly effective. "Janet," Sarah spoke into her intercom, "bring me the files on the last 3 building renovations we completed. And get Roger from legal up here." She paused, then added, "Tell him to bring the special circumstances clause templates." While waiting, Sarah pulled up Judge Barrett's tenant profile on her tablet. His application from last year practically dripped with self-importance. "As a sitting judge, I expect accommodations befitting my position." She smiled, remembering how he'd demanded preference during the selection process, dropping hints about his influence in city affairs. Roger Phillips, her head of legal affairs, arrived carrying a leather portfolio. At 65, he'd seen enough discrimination in his own career to appreciate what Sarah was about to do. "I assume this is about our friend in 1701, he asked, settling into a chair. 7 minutes, Roger." Sarah leaned back, letting the words hang in the air. "He gave me community service for 7 minutes. I watched the footage, Roger nodded. Reminded me of my first time in court, 1976. Some things haven't changed as much as they should. He opened his portfolio. But some things have. Sarah spread out the renovation notices. Drafts she'd been working on all afternoon. I want this to be perfect. Legal, ethical, and absolutely impossible to challenge in court. Her smile carried decades of stored patience. Let's review the special circumstances clause. Together, they crafted a notice that was poetry in passive aggression. The renovation plan included essential infrastructure updates, coincidentally focused on the 17th floor, mandatory temporary relocations during work periods, rent adjustments based on tenant behavioral scores, a clause buried in the original lease, special assessments for premium units, noise disclosure agreements for extended construction hours. The beauty, Sarah explained, highlighting key passages, is in the details. See this part about civic responsibility and community standards. All his own words from court, Roger. Every single one. Janet entered with a fresh pot of coffee and the historical renovation files. Miss Thompson. Security called. Judge Barrett tried to access the building's ownership records today through a contact at City Hall. Sarah's smile widened. Perfect timing. Roger, add the transparency clause. You know, the one about full disclosure of ownership transition that requires 6 months' notice. Roger chuckled, making notes. You're not just playing chess while he's playing checkers, Sarah. You're playing three-dimensional chess while he's still learning to set up the board. The night deepened as they refined every detail. Sarah insisted on reviewing each clause twice, ensuring everything was unassailable. The final document was a masterpiece of malicious compliance, using Barrett's own courtroom rhetoric against him. One last thing, Sarah said, pulling out a separate folder. Add this community impact statement about how these renovations will provide jobs for local workers, including those in rehabilitation programs. Her eyes sparkled. The same programs he sends people to through his community service sentences. Roger raised an eyebrow. Now that's what I call poetic justice. As midnight approached, Sarah signed the final versions. The notices would go out tomorrow. Certified mail, of course, with copies to all tenants. Barrett's would include a special addendum about his premium unit requiring the most extensive work. Janet, Sarah called out to her equally dedicated assistant, who was still at her desk. Schedule a building inspection for next Tuesday. Make sure it's Murphy. You know, the one whose nephew got that harsh sentence from Barrett last month for a first-time offense. Standing at her window, Sarah watched the city lights twinkle. Somewhere out there, Barrett was probably sleeping soundly, unaware that his world was about to shift on its axis. She thought about the court fees she paid that morning. $250 that would soon seem like pocket change. 7 minutes, she whispered to her reflection. Let's see how he handles 7 months of karmic payback. The notice on her desk caught the lamplight, its official letterhead gleaming. Variety Gardens Renovation Projects, a community enhancement initiative. Phase 1 would begin next week. Judge Barrett was about to learn that true justice sometimes required a different kind of gavel. The Thompson Real Estate Holdings lobby gleamed with understated luxury. All marble floors, chrome accents, and walls of windows stretching 2 stories high. Judge William Barrett's footsteps echoed against the polished stone as he stormed toward the reception desk, renovation notice crumpled in his fist. The morning light caught his face, highlighting the sleep-deprived shadows under his eyes. I need to speak with management. Now, his voice carried the same authoritative tone he used to command his courtroom. The young receptionist, Maya, glanced at her computer screen where a note from Sarah flashed. Expected visitor, Judge Barrett. Protocol 7 in effect. Of course, Your Honor, Maya replied with practiced politeness. Miss Thompson has been expecting you. 18th floor. She gestured toward the executive elevator, hiding a small smile as she watched him process the name. The elevator ride gave Barrett 18 floors to rehearse his speech about tenant rights and judicial connections. He'd made 3 calls to his contacts in the housing department yesterday, all of whom had suddenly become remarkably unavailable. The elevator doors opened directly into a stunning reception area with panoramic views of Lake Michigan. Janet Chen sat at her desk, calmly typing. She looked up, her expression pleasant but unrevealing. "Judge Barrett, Ms. Thompson will see you now." Barrett strode toward the mahogany double doors, ready to assert his authority. He pushed them open with the confidence of a man used to making others bend to his will. The words he prepared died in his throat. Sarah Thompson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, silhouetted against the morning sky. She turned slowly, and Barrett felt the ground shift beneath his feet as recognition dawned. She wore the same Burberry suit from court, her expression a masterpiece of professional neutrality. "Judge Barrett," she said smoothly, gesturing to a chair, notably smaller than her own executive seat. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." Barrett's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror. The renovation notice trembled slightly in his hand. You're the owner of Barrett Gardens?" "Yes." Sarah moved to her desk with deliberate grace. "Please, have a seat. I believe you wanted to discuss the upcoming renovations, 7 months of essential improvements." She paused meaningfully. "Though it might run longer. Sometimes these things take more time than expected." Barrett remained standing, his judicial demeanor cracking. "This is about the parking ticket." It wasn't a question. "Oh no, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the same condescending tone he'd used in court. "This is about civic responsibility. Your words, I believe." She opened a folder on her desk. "The renovations are completely necessary, I assure you. We have quite detailed documentation." She pressed a button on her desk phone. "Janet, please bring in the full renovation portfolio for Judge Barrett's review. All 700 pages." Barrett sank into the chair, his authority deflating. Through the window behind Sarah, he could see his courthouse in the distance, suddenly looking very small. "Of course," Sarah continued, examining a document, "we could discuss alternative arrangements. Your unit's rent adjustment might be negotiable." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "Though I should warn you, I don't respond well to emotional appeals. In my office, we deal with facts, not excuses." The morning sun highlighted the awards and degrees on her wall, achievements that Barrett had never imagined when he'd looked down at her from his bench. His own reflection in the window showed a man confronting his prejudices in real time. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice notably softer, "I may have been hasty in court." "Hasty?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "No, Your Honor. You were doing your job exactly as you've always done it. The only difference is, this time you did it to someone who could hold up a mirror." She stood, smoothing her suit jacket. "Now about those renovations. Shall we review the community service requirements for maintaining tenant residence during construction?" Barrett's hand touched his collar, suddenly feeling very tight. The 7 minutes he'd punished her for stretched before him into 7 months of karmic retribution, all perfectly legal, all meticulously documented. And Sarah Thompson was just getting started. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Sarah Thompson's office as she studied Judge Barrett's increasingly uncomfortable posture. The portfolio of renovation plans lay open between them, each page a carefully crafted reminder of how the tables had turned. "Let's review your options, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same measured tone he'd used in court. "The standard renovation package would require you to relocate for approximately 7 months. Or," she paused, letting the silence fill the space between them, "we could explore some alternatives." Barrett shifted in his chair, his usual courtroom confidence nowhere to be found. The Manhattan skyline behind Sarah served as a backdrop to her authority, the city itself seeming to lean in to watch his humbling. "What kind of alternatives?" he asked, his voice notably lacking its usual boom. Sarah opened another folder, this one filled with photographs and newspaper clippings. Before we discuss that, I'd like to share something with you. She spread out the contents across her desk. This is Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, the elderly tenant I was helping when I got that parking ticket. She's a retired civil rights attorney. Barrett's eyes flickered over the images. Sarah at community legal workshops, scholarship ceremonies for minority students, housing initiatives for low-income families. Then came the more uncomfortable documents, statistical analyses of his own sentencing patterns, broken down by race and gender. Fascinating reading, Sarah commented, tapping a particularly damning graph. Your sentences for minorities average 40% longer than those for white defendants with similar offenses. Did you know that? The judge's face flushed. Those numbers don't tell the whole story. No, Sarah agreed, surprising him. They don't. The whole story is sitting right here in this office. The whole story is about a successful black businesswoman who still gets judged by the color of her skin before the content of her character, even by those sworn to uphold justice. She stood and walked to her window, looking out over the city they both served in different ways. You know what the irony is, Judge Barrett? When I bought this building, I kept the previous owner's name because I knew it would make things easier. Tenants feel more comfortable when they can assume their landlord looks like them. Barrett watched her, seeing for the first time not just a defendant or a landlord, but a human being who had navigated a world of prejudices he'd never had to face. The renovations, Sarah continued, turning back to him, are real. This building needs updating. But the timeline, the inconvenience, the selective enforcement of certain clauses. She smiled slightly. Well, let's call those a lesson in perspective. What do you want? Barrett asked quietly. Want? Sarah returned to her desk, settling into her chair. I want you to understand something. Every person who comes before you in court has a story, a context, a life you know nothing about. That young man you sentenced last week for a broken taillight, he works 3 jobs to support his sick mother. The woman you fined for an expired meter, she was rushing her child to the emergency room. She leaned forward. I don't want revenge, Judge Barrett. I want change. Real change, starting in courtroom 4B. Barrett sat in silence, absorbing her words. Finally, he spoke. The renovation plans. We'll proceed. Sarah finished for him, but perhaps not as extensively as originally planned. Your actions in the coming months will determine exactly how disruptive they need to be. She pressed a button on her phone. Janet, please bring in the modified renovation proposal and those diversity training schedules we discussed. Barrett looked up sharply. Diversity training. Part of your alternative package, Sarah explained. You'll be attending sessions at the Community Law Center. They're hosting a series on implicit bias in the justice system. I'm one of the speakers. Her smile held both challenge and hope. Consider it a different kind of community service. As Janet entered with the new documents, Barrett realized that Sarah Thompson had given him something his years on the bench never had, a chance to see justice from the other side of the gavel. And somehow, that felt like the heaviest sentence of all. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of courtroom 4B, illuminating a subtly different scene from that fateful day. Judge William Barrett sat at his bench, but gone was the imperious tilt of his head, replaced by something more thoughtful, more aware. A young black woman stood before him, explaining how she parked in a loading zone while helping her elderly neighbor carry groceries upstairs. 6 months ago, this would have been a straightforward fine. Today, Barrett listened with new ears. In the gallery, Sarah Thompson sat quietly observing, dressed in another impeccable suit. She'd made a habit of attending Barrett's court sessions occasionally, not as an intimidation tactic, but as a silent witness to transformation. The renovation work at Barrett Gardens had indeed proceeded, but with considerably less disruption than originally planned, matching the judge's own renovations of character. Ms. Jackson, Barrett addressed the defendant, his voice carrying a warmth that made several regular courthouse attendees exchange surprised glances. While parking regulations exist for important reasons, this court also recognizes that community service sometimes takes unexpected forms. Your assistance to your neighbor was, in itself, a service to our community. He paused, remembering his own lessons from the past months. Case dismissed. During the morning recess, Barrett found himself in the courthouse corridor, facing Sarah. Their encounters had evolved from tense confrontations to something approaching mutual respect. "Your Honor," Sarah nodded, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "I see justice is being served in new ways these days." Barrett gestured to a nearby bench. As they sat, he pulled out a folded newspaper article, a piece about the impact of his recent sentencing reforms. "The statistics are changing," he said quietly. "The racial disparities in my courtroom have dropped by 60%. "I noticed," Sarah replied. "Though I suspect the real changes aren't captured in statistics." She was right. Barrett thought about the diversity training sessions, where he'd started as a reluctant participant and ended up becoming a regular contributor. He remembered the moment one of his colleagues had asked why he'd changed his approach, and he'd found himself sharing the story of a 7-minute parking ticket that had altered his entire perspective. "The renovations at Barrett Gardens are almost complete," Sarah mentioned casually. "The building's value has increased significantly. You made a good choice in housing, even if you didn't know who owned it at the time." Barrett chuckled softly, something he rarely did in the courthouse. "Life has a way of teaching us what we need to learn, doesn't it? Though some teachers are more effective than others." A young law clerk approached, carrying a stack of cases for the afternoon session. Among them was another parking violation, another story waiting to be heard with new ears. "You know," Barrett said, standing to return to his courtroom, "I never did thank you." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "For the renovations, for not doing what I would have done in your position, for choosing education over punishment, for showing me that true justice requires understanding, not just judgment." The afternoon session was about to begin, and both had duties to return to. He to his bench, she to her empire. But something had shifted in Milwaukee's justice system, starting in courtroom 4B and rippling outward. As Sarah walked toward the courthouse exit, she passed a framed copy of the Constitution, its words about equal justice under law catching the light. She smiled, thinking about how change sometimes required a parking ticket, a renovation notice, and the courage to hold up a mirror to power. Judge Barrett settled into his afternoon session, each case an opportunity to demonstrate what he'd learned. The iron gavel had been replaced by something stronger, wisdom tempered by humility, authority balanced with understanding. And somewhere in a drawer of his chambers lay a paid parking ticket for 7 minutes overtime, kept as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from unexpected teachers, and true justice requires not just the letter of the law, but the growth of those who serve it.